Alright, welcome back. This is Lesson 11, Administering Windows 7, and this is Part 2. In the last installment, we talked a little bit about troubleshooting techniques. I'd like to talk a little bit now about troubleshooting tools that are available for administering Windows 7 and diagnosing Windows 7 issues. We've actually covered quite a few of these tools, starting with Chapter 1 with the Upgrade Advisor, and Lesson 2 we talked about WinRS.exe and WinRS.exe Transfer. In Lesson 4 we talked about the Disk Management Snap-in, and we talked about the Device Manager as well. In Lesson 5 we covered quite a few of those tools. We talked about the Network and Sharing Center, we talked about Network Map, Network Diagnostics, and we even talked about some command line utilities that were beneficial, particularly for diagnosing network issues like ipconfig, ping, tracer, and nslookup. Now, we also, when we hit Lessons 7, 8, 9, we looked at looking at the Local Security Policies console. And in Lesson 8, we talked about the Event Viewer, the Performance Monitor, and then we moved on to Performance Information and Tools. In Lesson 9, we talked about tools that were available that you could use to manage local user accounts, mainly the User Accounts Control Panel and the Local Users and Groups Snap-in. And just in the last chapter, we talked about Windows Defender and the Malicious Software Removal Tool, both of which are used to help remove or prevent spyware and viruses from messing up the operating system. So we've talked about quite a few of these tools that are available to the average IT administrator. So I'd like to take a moment and talk a little bit about some tools that we haven't talked about, which would be remote assistance, remote desktop, and Windows RE or system recovery tools. And we're going to talk a lot about remote access technologies right now. So I'd like to start off talking about Microsoft Management Console, or having the ability to redirect snap-ins and creating remote console. And then we're going to move on to remote assistance, remote desktop, and we'll finish up with remote management as well. Okay? So Microsoft Management Console. We've talked about Microsoft Management Console and how we can manage resources with it on the local machine. But what you may not know is that you can also redirect an existing snap-in to another system and manage another system that way. You can also create what's called a custom console with snap-ins that are automatically directed to other systems when the MMC is launched. Now, before you can do either of these, you have to have an administrative account or have administrative access on the remote systems that you're going to be tying in with MMC. And once you have verified that you do have administrative access on those machines, then you can decide exactly which one of these strategies would work best for you. Now, redirecting a snap-in is very easy. You have a snap-in that you've already created to manage a local system. Now, one thing you need to realize is that not every snap-in has the ability to connect to a remote computer. That's because some don't need it. For example, the Active Directory Domain Services console automatically locate domain controllers for the current domain and access the directory service from there. There's no need to specify a computer name for that. And there are a few other snap-ins as well that would fall into this range. One of the surefire ways to tell whether or not the snap-in can be directed to a specific system other than the local system is by looking into the action menu and looking for something that says connect to a different computer. If you see that within the action menu, then it's a pretty good guess that you can use that console to actually connect to a remote system. Now, this technique is great if you are just doing an impromptu, you're just looking at a different management task on a different system. But it's limited by the fact that you can access only one computer at a time. You also have to open the computer and redirect it every time you want to access that system. Now, you can do this in a more permanent way by creating a remote console, a custom console, that will allow you to add multiple copies of the same snap-in to a custom console and point each one of those snap-ins to a different computer. So what you can actually do with a custom console is that when you launch it, you can actually begin monitoring several systems at once. This is a very powerful tool because this would allow you as an IT administrator to say manage several different stations at once. And be able to use that to check the availability of resources, make sure that the systems are operating within normal parameters. So This is a very interesting new way of handling remote access and remote monitoring for systems. Now, another great tool, and this is not new with Windows 7, but it's certainly available for many of the newer versions of Windows, is using remote assistance. Now, remote assistance enables a person at one location to connect to a computer at another location. When they're connected, you can view, chat with, or completely take control of the system. This is a great tool for technical support. You can follow a user or actually show a user what to do, or use it for training purposes. And it's a great troubleshooting tool. You can remote into a system, saving you the time and effort of having to walk or drive over to a remote location and perform these very same tasks in person, therefore increasing your productivity. Now, remote assistance does have to be configured. You can do this through the System Properties menu, and there's actually a tab for remote, and you just have to be sure that the remote assistance box is checked to allow remote assistance connections to the computer. Now, there are some advanced options, but generally you have to be sure that you can allow remote assistance connections to the computer. Likewise, I can also use group policy to make sure that this remote assistance is available. Simply by going into the computer's local policy settings, browse to the computer configuration, administrative templates, the system, and then remote assistance container, and enable the solicited remote assistance policy. I can do that, and I can do that on every system using group policy management. Now, the user must send what's called an invitation in order to use remote assistance. The invitation must be sent to the person that the user wishes to connect to. Usually it's the IT administrator, but it could be anyone. And that invitation can be sent via email, or it can be saved to a file and then sent using some alternate method. So there are a couple variations there on how you can actually send that invitation out. Another thing I should point out is that because of the potential damage that could be done by using the wrong assistant, there are some protective features that are built into remote assistance. We talked about invitations, the fact that no person can connect to another person using remote assistance unless you've received that invitation. Also, there's interactive connectivity. When an expert accepts an invitation from the client and attempts to connect to the computer, the user must be present in the client console in order to grant access. Then there's the client-side control. The client will always have ultimate control over remote assistance connections. Therefore, the client can terminate the connection at any time, just simply by pressing the escape key or clicking the stop command. Remote control configuration allows us to go through the system property sheet or through the remote assistance group, and users and administrators can specify whether the experts are permitted to take control of the client computers. An expert who has read-only access cannot modify the computer's configuration in whatsoever. Last but not least, firewalls provide some protection as well. Remote assistance uses Transmission Control Protocol, TCP port number 3389 for all its network communications. Therefore, you can always block that port if need be, if you want to be really sure that no one's going to use remote assistance on your network. Alright, so remote desktop. Now, remote desktop and remote assistance are often interchanged, but they're different animals altogether. While remote assistance is intended to enable the users to obtain interactive help from some professional, remote desktop basically is an administrative feature that allows you to connect to other computers from remote locations. There's no interaction required when you use remote desktop. Now, remote desktop, once again, this is something that can be enabled on the client or controlled through group policy, whether through domain group policy or local group policy. So if you don't want people using remote desktop on your network, there are ways to eliminate that. Now, when connected, it's just like sitting in front of your computer. The experience is almost exactly the same, and it's usually used for administrators to connect to servers that are not easily accessible. That's how remote desktop kind of got its start. But you see remote desktop used in a lot of corporate environments now, as people are working outside of the office and they need a way to connect directly to their desktop. You're finding more and more administrators are allowing remote desktop sessions into the corporate environment. We used it in my old job. So remote desktop certainly can be a benefit, but you also have the security implications associated with it too. So you have to be careful and be able to manage that in some way. Remote Desktop uses an implementation of Remote Desktop services from Windows Server in order for it to operate. And it communicates with the host computer using something called Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. This protocol essentially transmits screen information. It transmits the keystrokes, the mouse movements between the two computers. And any applications that you launch on the client are still running on the remote computer. Whenever you are remoting into the system, you are truly remoting into a system, and all you're seeing is through RDP everything that's going on that remote system. When you log off of Remote Desktop, if you do not shut everything down, it will continue to run on that remote desktop. Now, provided that Remote Desktop is activated, simply by clicking on Start All Programs, Accessories, and Remote Desktop Connection, you should get a screen very similar to the one that you see here. This will allow you to enter the computer by name or by IP address, and then choose Connect, and then it will prompt you just like you were sitting down at the desk of a real computer, and it will ask you for the password and the whole 9 yards. Windows Remote Management is a command line utility. That means that you can execute programs from the command line on remote computers without having to open a remote desktop session at all. Once again, the same thing applies with this service just as it does for any of the other services. You have to have some sort of access for the computer in order for this to work. Windows Remote Management is a Windows 7 service. It does allow you to execute commands on the computers. It uses Windows PowerShell or the Windows Remote Shell, which is called WinRS.exe command. It's a command line program. However, Windows 7 does not start the service by default, and it does not configure the computer to allow remote management communications. So in order to do this, you do have a procedure that you have to follow to make this happen. Now, in order to configure the remote management console, you have to do this at the command prompt. So you would have to go into Start All Programs, Accessories, right-click the command prompt, and you have to be sure to run this as an administrator. Once you've entered the administrator credentials, you're going to want to type in what you see here, WinRm space quickconfig. When you do that, the command prompts you to start the WinRm service, and then you will type Y for yes and enter to continue. Now, the command will then prompt you to create what's called a listener for the incoming remote management request and configure the required firewall exception. Just type Y for yes again, hit enter to continue, and then close the administrator command prompt window. This will allow you to make sure that the Windows Remote Management is configured for the system. You can then execute commands on other computers that have been configured in a similar manner. To execute the command from the Windows 7 command prompt, you will have to use the WinRS.exe program. And there are some switches that can be beneficial for you. So if you type in something like WinRS space -R, that's what we call a switch, and then colon computer will specify the name of the computer on which you want to execute the command. Using a NetBIOS name or the fully qualified domain name, or FQDN, which is the optimal way of doing it these days. What you see here on the screen is a good example of a typical WinRS command. To execute a PowerShell command on the remote system, you must open an elevated PowerShell session and use the following syntax, which is ICM space computer and then the actual command. Now, the computer, of course, specifies the name of the computer you wish to execute the command, and the command prompt, or the command, is the actual PowerShell command that you're going to execute on the computer, the remote computer. And the command must be enclosed by the curly brackets, otherwise it will not work. Alright, so this is a good stopping point for the part 2 of our series here for chapter 11. All of these tools are beneficial to the IT administrator, but being able to use remote services, remote administration tools, is paramount in today's IT industry. People are demanding more and more productivity out of the IT admin, and by using remote session tools, you can cut down on having to travel and walk around significantly, and therefore improve your productivity levels. Alright, so when we come back, we're going to talk about troubleshooting, installation, and startup issues in our third part. Alright?